Racing cars has been a thing ever since the second car was ever produced. Human nature has proved that people are competitive and they just want to feel better than the next person. Um, there's been many types of car racing over the years, but arguably the most simple kind is drag racing. Drag racing is a race that is just two cars lining up and seeing who can accelerate to either the eighth mile or a quarter mile faster. While drag racing seems like a really simple sport, it actually has a really rich history. And from the family cars of the 1950s to the modern cars of today that can do 300 miles an hour and do a quarter mile in about 3 seconds, drag racing has always been a spectacle in the automotive industry. Drag racing has probably always been prevalent since cars were first produced because it is the simplest type of racing. For a long time, people didn't really even know what to call this sport because it had no name and it also wasn't documented for the same reason. Eventually, the term drag racing got coined to it, and while it's still unclear where that term came from, the most commonly accepted theory is it was called drag racing because a lot of times it was done on the main drag of a town. The earliest days of documented drag racing was mostly street racing, and sometimes they would race on the dry lake beds of Nevada or Southern California. The first drag racers were mainly World War II veterans who were coming back from war, and they just needed something to do that was exciting because they were used to getting shot at. And this ended up working out really well because a lot of the veterans were coming back with mechanical skill they didn't have before because they spent their time working on airplanes and other military vehicles. When they came home, obviously, they couldn't just sit in a rocking chair and relax. So they would go to the junkyard and find the cheapest, lightest car that nobody wanted, and they would put a big motor in it and start to compete against their friends. It didn't take long for these racers to realize that an easy way to make cars faster was to make them lighter. So eventually, they would just get rid of everything that they didn't need off the car, and soon this became out of hand, and all that was left of the car was the frame, the wheels, and the steering wheel. This became known as the rail because it was two frame rails, but it is also referred to as the dragster. Another thing they discovered that was more volatile fuels would make the cars have more horsepower and in turn go faster. Some of the more volatile fuels that weren't gasoline that they would use was either alcohol or nitromethane. Nitromethane being the more volatile of the two. Now, nitromethane is extremely dangerous and, if not handled properly, can have some very poor results. During the early days of nitromethane, explosions were very common, and deaths of drivers was also very common. Eventually, the NHRA, which was the premier sanctioning body of drag racing, would ban the use of nitromethane. This pretty much just opened the door for other sanctioning bodies to open up, and they would allow the racers to use nitromethane. And also, drag racers have always been notorious for being pretty good at cheating, so they would find out how to run the fuel anyway. But what in turn ended up happening was the NHRA was losing racers to other sanctioning bodies, and they were also losing spectators because nitromethane is extremely exciting. So after a few years, the NHRA let racers use nitromethane again, but over those few years, some safety things started to happen in order to make using nitromethane a lot safer. So originally, a dragster, the engine was right in front of the driver, and when something goes wrong with nitromethane and explodes, the engine would blow up in the racer's lap. And obviously this wasn't good for many reasons. One reason was because they got burnt pretty bad. The other reason was because when there's a fire in your face, you can't see. So eventually, Don Garlitz, who could be considered like the Michael Jordan of drag racing, built a dragster with the engine in the back, so that when something exploded, the fire would just follow you, and since you were moving, it wouldn't be a huge deal. Well, people laughed at his creation and said it wouldn't work, and he did struggle with it for quite a while, but once he figured out the combination, he everyone decided they wanted to switch to that too, because it's a lot safer. And while explosions are exciting, they're not fun, and they're not cheap either. And since then, there hasn't really been any major alteration to the style of a dragster. Now, there have been plenty of technological breakthroughs that make these cars faster, such as the addition of computers to dragsters. So, while drag racing seems like a fairly archaic sport, it's actually in recent times become very high tech, and teams are investing a lot of money in computer technology and to be able to have someone that knows how to use the computer. So drag racing is on the cutting edge of automotive technology, and a lot of drag racing technology is starting to be seen in modern cars like Mustangs and Camaros. Um, Drag racing has been part of people's lives ever since its creation because it's fun and addicting and it gives you a thrill.